thanks to the school here for co-organising this event. I'm very grateful for Mark Chandler, a member of the East West Institute Board, for making this contribution to our efforts on public-private partnerships to counter terrorism. The East West Institute has been working in this field for about 4 years through a global conference held in Brussels every year, co-hosted by the World Customs Organisation and sponsored for the last 2 years by the country holding the chair of the G8. Next year in February it'll be also co-sponsored by Japan in its capacity as chair of the G8. Our work in this field has revolved for the last 18 months around the Russian government's initiative in the framework of the G8 on public-private partnerships to counter terrorism. We've got a couple of small publications up the back which people are free to take a couple of copies of if they like at the end of the session. Our website will reveal further information on those programs. I'm very delighted that people from the diplomatic corps at the UN have been able to join us today, especially the relevant committee and others from diplomatic missions. Great to be in an academic environment again. I haven't been in one for a while. The East West Institute is a think and do tank based in Brussels. It engages in largely second track activity with some public dimensions to our work, largely in the area of counter-terrorism, violent extremism and the like. Thank you again. Over to you, Stuart.
Thanks very much. I'm the School of International and Public Affairs representative. I'm a professor here. I teach terrorism and American foreign policy. I have a fairly similar background. Brandon, who I'll introduce in a few minutes, he works on the House side. I used to work on the Senate side on some of these issues. And I want to welcome everyone for this event. It's an important topic, the role of the private sector, coordination with governments in response to the threat of bioterrorism. And a way that I think it's interesting to introduce this topic today and the speakers is to point out a report published in this month's Journal of the American Medical Association. Some of you may have seen the report, some of you may know about this pretty well, that a virulent antibiotic-resistant staph bacterium known as MRSA or MRSA has infected tens of thousands of Americans, killing roughly 1 out of every 5 of those infected. In 2005, the year of the study, roughly 95,000 Americans developed an invasive infection from MRSA and nearly 19,000 died. Now, why do I bring this up to introduce a talk about bioterrorism? I do so because when most people think of bioterrorism, they usually think of potential attacks using toxins like ricin and botulinum or non-contagious pathogens like anthrax or even known contagious pathogens like smallpox. And as troubling as those attacks might be to ponder, and a lot of people ponder those attacks, the real danger, I believe, and the real public policy challenge is that some individual or group will introduce some genetically modified or synthetically created bacterium or virus which would be highly contagious and impossible to treat using known antibiotics or other conventional medical countermeasures. By all accounts, MRSA is a naturally occurring bacterium. But imagine if MRSA, or even a far more potent agent, was created by some group or individual intent on killing as many people as possible and actively sought to secretly infect as large a population of people as possible. We would have to multiply the numbers of casualties by 10 times or possibly even much, much more than that. And there, in a nutshell, lies the challenge of bioterrorism. Bioterrorism is very attractive to terrorists, groups who seek to both instill a lot of fear and panic in populations as well as kill a lot of people. Bioterrorism is extremely cost effective. You only need a small amount of contagious pathogen to potentially kill and injure a lot of people. Human biology takes care of the rest. And perhaps the biggest challenge, and this is what we're going to get into today, on this issue is the dual-edged nature of synthetic biology and other areas of biotechnology. All the tremendous recent advances in new biotechnology, such as work on the human genome and other genetic research, are helping to eradicate disease around the world and supply clean drinking water in parts of the less developed world and providing other public goods. But these very same technologies in the wrong hands can do all sorts of evil. And the challenge for the private sector, which does most of this research, and governments, which are elected to keep their citizens safe, is to ensure that the innovative spirit of scientific advancement can continue while proper safeguards are in place so new technologies cannot be used to orchestrate catastrophic events. So this balance between self-regulation, which is the optimal outcome of the private sector, to maximize entrepreneurial spirit with government intervention and regulation to maximize safeguards is this balance that we're going to be dealing with for many generations to come. And it's a very big challenge, which is going to require a lot of smart, insightful, and creative initiatives and policies for really for generations to come. So here to talk about these and other issues relating to bioterrorism in the private sector and the public coordination are our three distinguished guests. I believe they'll be speaking in order of first up will be Dr. Mark Chandler, who's currently CEO of Biophysical Corporation. He's a leading expert on biological agents. He spent 25 years in the field. He holds a PhD in immunology from University of Texas Southwestern Medical School. And our second speaker, I believe, will be Brandon Declet, who I mentioned a little bit before. He works over the House of Representatives on the Homeland Security Committee. He works as a counsel there, and that committee has oversight on the Homeland Security Department, and he works on these issues. And our third speaker will be Dr. Greg Austin, who's Vice President, Director of the Global Security Program and Policy Innovation at the East-West Institute, which I believe everyone knows about. So I'm going to turn it over first to Dr. Mark Chandler, and I look forward to hearing their remarks, and we will have some time for question and answer at the end.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, it is a pleasure to be here today. I kind of came into the area of bioterror unintentionally. My first company right out of grad school, we were producing toxins like ricin, like botulism. In fact, to my shame, my credit was that my company was the first producer of Botox, botulism toxin. And when the company that was asking us to produce it for us told us what they were going to do with it, that they were going to inject it to smooth wrinkles, I said, there's no way anybody's going to ever let you inject botulism just to smooth a wrinkle. I don't want that contract. So my business acumen is hopefully not going to lead the way to the scientific acumen. We do know that all terror is asymmetric, but bioterror is, I think, really giving some unique aspects to this asymmetry in that a very mild stimulus has a huge response. Like Stuart mentioned, the costs of producing a lot of these bioterror weapons are very small, and if they're unleashed on us, our response is going to be very expensive. We're going to do a lot of things to make sure this doesn't happen again. Also, one person can affect this event pretty effectively. And unlike a suicide bomber, they get away. Almost all the time, they would get away. And second, there are so many potential pathogens out there. I've got this broad range because there's a lot of talk that the Soviet Union really had advanced pretty far in developing the kinds of weapons that Dr. Gottlieb was talking about that really were genetically altering a lot of these organisms, making them either resistant to antibiotics or developing entire new organisms. So to really give an idea of which bioterror weapons could be most effective, we're going to sort of give a report card on how they work, looking at them as WMDs and as WMTs, weapons of mass terror. And those are, I think, really different. We'll look at how easy some of those are to acquire and use, as well as the countermeasures that are going to be applied potentially even before an attack, certainly during and after. So the first one we'll start off is bioterror as a weapon of mass destruction. They really don't work well that way. Most people picture a bioterror event happening where there's this big air burst over a city, dispersing anthrax over a broad area, infecting tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And we really don't have much good capability to do that. Just the process of a rapid dispersion generates enough heat in the organism to generally kill it. So it's not a really good way to kill a lot of people with one attack. There are good ways, though, to use them as weapons of mass terror. And we're going to go through some of these things because just a small amount, and I'm going to use ricin because that's what I'm most familiar with, a small amount of ricin can really wreak a lot of havoc. And some examples I'm going to be using are showing how easy it would be for one lone actor to cause a lot of these problems. Because, again, with that air burst that would disperse anthrax, that really has to be done by a state. That's going to be a big event. And states are moving away, I think, from bioterror. Whenever you get into big bioterror conference, there's a phrase that comes up all the time. It's called the realm of repugnance. A state that would use bioterror to indiscriminately kill innocent men, women, and children would be such a pariah that there's a lot of suspicion within the people talking about bioterror that they would be very hesitant to go that way. But a lone actor, we presume, would not. And so if you just think about a water fountain that might be in the hallway at Columbia. I went to Home Depot yesterday before I came up here, and for $5 I bought this. In about 1 minute, I could get inside the water fountain here. This tube would be filled with ricin. I just tighten this down, it punctures into the water line, and every time somebody gets a drink, it would siphon a little bit of ricin out of this tube, and you'd ingest it, and you die. That would be a $5 expense and 1 minute. And how would you begin to trace something like that if you had several water fountains all over the city that were like that? The fruit that is laid out at grocery stores all over, just imagine ricin in an atomizer and somebody going through spraying the grapes and the apples. If you didn't wash them well, one bite and you're gone. And that's where the terror starts coming in, I think, because when your 5-year-old child starts just eating grapes and they die from that, and you get somebody moving all around the country spraying the produce in grocery stores, completely undetectable. You know, there's no way to smell or see the toxin. That's going to be terror. Also, say a jihadi wants to get a job filling Coke machines, going around town with a delivery truck. And I'm looking like a little bit of a Mr. Wizard here, but you've got a beaker of ricin, and he takes about 20 or 30 Cokes, dips them in, lets the ricin dry around the outside, and then he goes and fills these Coke machines around town. You buy a Coke, about every 20th Coke is going to have ricin on it, and you're gone. You know, you'll die very quickly and badly from the amount of ricin you could get to dry on a Coke can. And it's in a nice refrigerated environment. The toxin will stay potent for months if it has to. So there really are very good ways to use toxins or other bioterror to terrorize a population when it's so indiscriminate and it's moving down into children as well. So I think as a WMT, they're really hard to beat. Now, there have been a lot of books, Hot Zone, Cobra Event, things like that. Yeah, you know, that's maybe true that you can build a virus, but it's not so easy. You know, you can do it on 3 feet of bench space, but you've got to have maybe $500,000 worth of laboratory equipment to really make something like this happen. Now, publishing, like some scientists did a couple years ago, exactly how to make a smallpox virus, so somebody could read that and just see exactly how to do it, you know, that's problematic. That much information out there is going to, I think, cause I think that scientists are going to be restricted in their ability to publish things that can have such dual use. Yeah, it was an interesting scientific trick, but somebody wanting to reproduce that for ill effect can cause a lot of trouble with that. So I don't think that we need to worry again from the lone actor that he's out there making these complex viruses. They're really hard to do. But the toxins, again, are really easy to do. This is the rosary pea. This is where ricin comes from, the castor bean. The rosary pea is, if I were going to be a terrorist, what I would use, because we've got ways to detect ricin. Ricin's just so well known, it's in the public consciousness. But nobody's really looked at the equally potent toxin from the rosary pea. And this is a seed. It's the prettiest little seed you've ever seen. Hard as a rock. You know, a kid could eat it. There's no way he could bite through it. But you know, the toxin, it was first found in the Dominican Republic, where it grows all over the place. They would drill holes in these seeds and string them together to make rosaries. And if you dipped it in varnish after you strung the rosary together, it'd be safe. But sometimes they skip that step. And a lot of people they pray the rosary and they put the rosary in their mouth, and they were dropping from the toxin leaching out of that hard seed. But if you had access to these seeds, and again, all of these are growing all over the temperate part of the world, really easy to find, and a blender, you could make a serviceable amount of ricin. Very easily done. So I give that a C. Ease of use, you know, we talked about this, but remember in Oregon when the Rajneesh clan decided they wanted to run the election, they wanted to win all the elections, and so they put, I think it was salmonella or shigella all over the salad bars in town, because they wanted everybody to have to be sick enough that they couldn't get to the polls. And I'm not sure how that vote came out, but they did arrest a lot of people on that. But again, ease of use is something that I think really is clearly an A for a lot of bioterror weapons. Countermeasures, looking before attack, that's finding somebody when they're in the process of making a batch of bacteria or ricin. And again, I'm going to concentrate more on toxins because you're not going to be able in your apartment really make a good batch of virus or bacteria. That's something that would happen more in a state-sponsored environment. So the counter intel to find a lone actor, that's not going to be too effective, I think. During attack, biosensors and vaccines have been our most prominent method of looking at what's going on. And I'm going to go into a little more detail on them because I don't think this is a very good approach. I want to look first at air monitoring, and another company that I have, we worked with Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories to make the first big biosensor for detecting airborne pathogens. We made this component down here, and this is all the sensing, you know, this is the stuff that brings the air in and all that. But you start looking at a city like New York or any big city, and you think of how many biosensors would have to be placed through there throughout the city to really protect the population, and it just becomes impossible because each machine just covers about 5,000 square feet. A decent size office building could easily require 75 of those machines, and they were $250,000. And then they only looked for 15 of the pathogens, and we know we've got 50 of them. So if you want to put your faith in biosensors, you can do that if the terrorist is going to meet your criteria. There's 3 criteria he has to meet. He's got to let the toxin loose or the organism loose in a building that has a biosensor. And he's got to pick one of the ones that biosensor is made to detect. And finally, he's got to release it in an airborne fashion. He can't go through the water supply. If he meets all those criteria, then the biodetector will sense it and it will let you know that you've been under attack. But the problems don't stop there, because let's just take a situation where the terrorist has met all these criteria, and at 12:30 during the lunch hour, he releases a biohazard in a big building. So the sensor, checking every hour, still has a half hour before it's going to be picking up, even sampling that release. So at 1 o'clock, it sucks in a lot of air, and it starts the chemical process to look and see if there might have been a biohazard. At 2 o'clock, it takes about an hour, the alarm goes off. So you've had an hour and a half of lunch hour, people going in and out of the buildings, swirling around in a bunch of biohazard. Still, the alarm's gone off, and what are you going to do about it? Are you going to lock down the building? I know if I was in there and I knew a biohazard had been released, a window probably wouldn't stop me. I'd find a way to get out. And yet there have been so many people moving in and out in that hour and a half. You're going to lock people up and make them improve their odds of being exposed to this? It just doesn't seem like, even if it works perfectly, it doesn't really give you that much to help stop the terrorism. Vaccines are another thing that I'm going to have to go through this real quick again because I think we skipped a slide. Well, vaccines are another problem in that, how do you decide what to make a vaccine against? There are so many different pathogens. Why do you pick just one? Well, that's what we did. The state decided first that we're going to make a vaccine against anthrax. Never mind that antibiotics will cure it. If you know you've been attacked, then with anthrax, then Cipro to the rescue. It will really knock it out. But there are a lot of other things that are going to require vaccines as well. This was the first contract awarded for vaccine development, almost $1 billion for anthrax. It was canceled. It was actually formally canceled just last year because they couldn't do it effectively. But even if you did want to spend $1 billion for each of the 30 or 50 vaccines, who's going to want to take that? Vaccines carry their own risks. Any vaccine carries risks. Measles, mumps, rubella does. But the side effects outweigh the risk of any individual being a target of a bioterror attack. Even soldiers in the battlefield, to get 30 vaccinations would probably be way more risky than your odds of getting hit outside. Which brings us to biosignatures. And that may be a new approach to many of you, but I think it may be one of the best. We're first going to know that we've been attacked by a bioterror weapon when long lines start forming at emergency rooms with people having symptoms that docs don't normally see. That's how we're going to find out. We need at that time to know what the pathogen is and who has really been infected, because once the word gets out that we're under some sort of bioterror attack, anybody who has a cold, anybody who feels a little bit bad at all is going to be storming the emergency room. We need to be able to separate who really has been exposed to the pathogen and who hasn't. Without these two, you really can't come up with the where, when, and how either. You've got to know who's been infected and with what to be able to trace down all the other things that you need to know to prevent this from happening anymore. So looking at whether it's a toxin, a virus, or a bacteria, you need to do that. You need to know that because you have different responses for it. And the way you do that is by looking at biomarkers. Biomarkers, you know what they are. Glucose is a biomarker for diabetes if it's at very high level. This is just a chemical in your blood that you can detect. Cholesterol is a biomarker for cardiovascular risk. At high levels, it builds up in your blood. Well, every pathogen has its own specific fingerprint, its own biosignature of what it looks like in the blood too. So a virus has a different set of chemicals that show up than bacteria. And bacteria have a different set of chemicals that will show up in your blood than do toxins. And so we've got to be able to understand what agent has been used to make people sick and who really has been infected. And then we can get a handle on a lot of the other questions. So knowing it's a bacterial infection lets us go right to antibiotics, unless in the case that Dr. Gottlieb was mentioning, it's that methicillin resistant, and then I'm not sure what we do. The viruses, most people presume now that even a widespread outbreak of smallpox or like the great influenza, we have supportive therapies now that would prevent the massive deaths that we saw before. You can't cure a virus, but you can ameliorate the symptoms enough that there won't be widespread death. Unfortunately, toxins, there's nothing available on those. There is no rescue from ricin or some of the other toxins, so we just need to find out how people are getting it and stop that. That's the only thing that we can really do. So if you look in conclusion at the 4 ways that we've tried to stop bioterrorism, with counterintelligence, trying to find it before it even happens, you know, that's really not, you've got to get very lucky to make that work. Biosensors, I really don't have much faith in those, again, because of all the criteria the terrorist has to meet, and then, all right, what do you do even if he does meet all those? Vaccines, too many agents, too much risk associated versus the risk of actually being a victim of bioterror attack. And finally, biosignatures. I think that doesn't prevent the first batch of people from dying, but it stops the process quicker than any other way that we have right now. We need to find out the biosignatures, and this is part of the science. It can be dual use as well, in that we can develop all this technology for anti-terrorism, but if we get struck with another influenza outbreak, knowing exactly who's got the worst strain of, like the old Spanish flu, biosignatures will help us in that arena as well. Unfortunately, where we're spending the money now is all in this other area, and that's where I think Brandon will talk about a lot of the focus now on Homeland Security and the things we can really do to maybe focus more on areas that can directly help after an attack.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Chandler. If you have questions, just keep track of them, and we'll have plenty of time. You can revisit any individual speaker you want to address after all 3 have a chance to get the remarks through. So let me introduce Brandon Declet. He will now speak.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today at the East West Institute. Like Stuart said, I'm counsel with the Committee on Homeland Security down in Washington. Chairman Benny Thompson is the chair of the committee. We've been working on quite a number of bills and pieces of legislation since the Congress began in January of 2007. Today I'd like to take some time to discuss the congressional perspective on Homeland Security broadly, and then move into a more detailed discussion of the threat from bioterrorism and private sector preparedness. The real deal, as you see up on the slides here, is an articulation of the committee's vision for securing the homeland. That vision has always included an understanding that the private sector plays a critical role in Homeland Security. Bioterrorism threat. Last week, the administration released its latest national strategy on Homeland Security. This is the 2nd strategy the administration has released. In that strategy, they describe the bioterrorism threat. The terrorists basically have the intent to acquire and use weapons of mass destruction and to inflict catastrophic damage on the United States, its allies, and other interests, including the private sector. So what is the real deal? The Department of Homeland Security is a relatively young organization. The department only started 4 years ago as a result of the Homeland Security Act of 2002. It is now the 2nd largest department in terms of people and budget behind the Department of Defense. So we're talking about a very, very huge organization here. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 combined agencies from across several federal departments. Unfortunately, since it's such a young organization, that integration has been extremely difficult. The focus in Congress, and particularly on the Committee on Homeland Security, has been in sort of 9 areas of concern, and we believe the private sector plays a role in all of them. First, of course, we need to improve the functionality, governance, and accountability of the Department of Homeland Security. If it's going to be the 2nd largest department in the federal government, it's got to work. 2, we've got to enhance security on all modes of transportation. 3, you've got to learn how to respond and recover in the wake of a natural catastrophe as a result of a bioterrorism event. 4th, the nation's critical infrastructure needs to be shored up against potential attacks, whether they be a car bomb or a bioterrorist attack. 5th, we need to secure the homeland, but we need to remember about our civil liberties, the Constitution, and our rights. We aren't willing to forego all of our rights for security. 7th, connecting the dots, intelligence. Dr. Chandler talked about this earlier. Trying to find out what's going to happen before it happens. We know that terrorists are interested in striking the United States. We know they may be interested in using weapons of mass destruction. As Donald Rumsfeld would say, that's a known unknown. But we don't know the exact specifics of any particular attack. Implementing common sense border and port security. Again, we need to think about what this means in terms of bioterrorism. Inspiring minds and developing technology. Again, this is all about the private sector, making sure that they have the ability to produce those products that we need to stay secure, and of course, working and preparing with the private sector. Improving basically the functionality and governance of the Department of Homeland Security. The department is in a state of crisis. They have good people, but bad organization. I believe since their inception in 2002, they've gone through 2 or 3 reorganizations. What needs to happen if we're going to get serious about combating the threat of bioterrorism is we need a department that functions, that works, that can effectively govern itself and integrate all the parts of the federal government that it has absorbed. 2, enhancing security. The role of the private sector here is critically important when it comes to securing all modes of transportation. This includes public transportation, such as the subways, and private modes of transportation, such as shipping vessels, rail, and air freight. Unfortunately, there's currently no national strategy for transportation security, meaning that the programs and agencies within the department responsible for securing these transportation nodes are doing so without an overarching plan or an idea of what the other departments in the federal government are doing. Without an overarching strategy, it's going to be continually difficult for the department to work with the private sector. And this is important because the private sector is keenly aware of its own vulnerabilities. They can work closely with security experts in the department to craft security solutions that make economic sense. The bottom line is that it's not necessary to sacrifice economic well-being for our own personal well-being. I believe it's possible to have both. 3, resiliency. Resilience response in the wake of a natural catastrophe. This is critically important to understand. We don't have yet a system that the Department of Homeland Security can point to and work with the private sector and tell them exactly what needs to be done in order to respond or recover from a potential attack. It's certainly an issue. The department needs to carry out a role, and its primary role is to be working with the owners and operators of basically our nation's critical infrastructure. The private sector, as everyone knows, owns about 85% of the nation's critical infrastructure. A bioterrorism attack is unlikely to cause long-term damage to critical infrastructure. But honestly, the private sector needs to be prepared to deal with the fact that the people who run their businesses and the nation's critical infrastructure will be unable to do so. In other words, the people we depend on to run our subways and make sure the electricity flows could be too sick to work. And we need to think about what we're going to do if that does happen. In addition, DHS has not yet completed an assessment of high-risk targets. When you talk about the federal government, you're always going to be talking about limited resources. There are limited resources available from the federal government, and unless an assessment is done of high-risk targets, resources are going to be misdirected. The private sector can help the department by working closely and informing it of what the high-risk targets are. They know what they are. They own them. They own 85% of them. Despite what you may believe, There is no reservoir of knowledge at DHS that is capable of identifying all the high-risk targets in a particular locality. What happens today is that DHS waits for states and localities to come to them and tell them, hey, these are our high-risk targets, or these are what we think are critical infrastructure. There is no one at DHS, no group of people at DHS who sit around a room and decide, well, this is what New York City's high-risk targets are. This is what New York City's critical infrastructure is. Securing and preserving, obviously, civil liberties. I mentioned this earlier. We need to be sure that as we move on, as the department grows and as we reevaluate our situation in terms of how secure we want to be, that we always keep in mind civil rights and civil liberties. We also have to keep in mind, and Dr. Chandler also mentioned this, is that researchers and the private sector, number one, have a right to continue their research. We shouldn't be limiting scientific advancement. We shouldn't be placing limits on researchers and doctors who are working on vaccines just because they have to work on a dangerous biological agent. So we definitely need to have some sort of balance there. Connecting the dots. I think this is the most important thing to think about. And Dr. Chandler also mentioned this earlier. There is an absolute gap in the quality of intelligence and information surrounding the threat of bioterrorism. As Dr. Chandler said, these biological agents are extremely difficult to track, as is people's potential exposure. A biological incident or a naturally occurring biological event, such as SARS or avian influenza, could be indistinguishable, at least in the early stages. Biointelligence and biosurveillance are the early warning systems necessary to detect the spread of disease, whether natural or intentional. As Dr. Chandler said, to date, these systems are not adequately developed. If a BioWatch sensor in Grand Central Station goes off right now, whatever biological agent was in the air has been there for a number of hours, and thousands upon thousands of people have been walking through Grand Central Terminal with no idea that they were being exposed to a potential biological agent. And until those sensors improve, we simply cannot rely upon them. Third, the United States does not have a framework for international cooperation in order to conduct biosurveillance. When the H5N1 avian influenza virus was breaking out in China, the federal government had no idea because the Chinese government decided to keep that a big secret. Same thing is happening in Indonesia. There is no framework that has been built that allows countries to exchange this type of information. Fourth, there's no single means to disseminate information to the private sector in the event of a bioterrorism event. Goldman Sachs downtown will find out about your bioterrorism attack the same way a lot of other people do. They'll turn on CNN. The systems that are in place, such as HISN and RISNet and LEO, maybe you've heard some of these acronyms, aren't tied together. They're not integrated. They're not seamless. The federal government is still working on disseminating information to the private sector through a single source. That currently hasn't happened yet. 7, implementing common sense borders. Again, this is also critically important when it comes to bioterrorism. Andrew Speaker was walking around the United States and traveling overseas with antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis for quite a bit of time, and was able to get back into this country. The same thing just today, the Washington Times, it was a report that a Mexican national had crossed the border 76 times with antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis, and no one had any idea about it. Not CBP, not any other agency within the Department of Homeland Security. So securing the borders has to also involve a sort of biosurveillance component. We need to be able to catch potential infectious disease as it comes into this country, and it needs to be integrated with whatever border technology that the United States government decides to lean upon. 8, inspiring minds and sort of developing technology. This week, the Department of Health and Human Services announced an investment of $55 million in bioterrorism countermeasures from 4 private sector companies. $55 million is a drop in the bucket. If you asked anyone on the Hill in Congress whether they thought $55 million was a lot of money, they tell you absolutely not. The federal budget is north of $2 trillion a year. So $55 million that HHS is spending today on bioterrorism countermeasures is lowly inadequate. The funding does come from a new Biological Advanced Research and Development Authority within HHS, where the advanced development of medical countermeasures is a key mission. And I think on the committee and in Congress, many believe it is very, very important. This type of partnership between the federal government and the private sector is taking advantage of the expertise that's already out there in the private sector. The government doesn't need to know it all. If it can work with the private sector, then you can have a seamless integration, and we can make the homeland safer. Unfortunately, we don't know if this is something that can be sustained over the long term. $55 million isn't a lot of money, and is it going to sustain 4 private sector companies who are working on these bioterrorism countermeasures? Private sector preparedness, and this is important because the 9/11 Commission was keenly aware that private sector preparedness is not a luxury. It is the cost of doing business in the post-9/11 world. It is ignored at a tremendous potential cost to lives, money, and national security. The Congress recently passed and the President signed H.R. 1, the 9/11 Commission Act, which implemented most, if not all, of the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. Within that act were private sector preparedness provisions, which Chairman Thompson and Congress believe are going to facilitate our response and our recovery from a bioterrorism attack. The elements, though, are voluntary. Like Stuart said, we don't want to place overly burdensome restrictions in the private sector. There's no reason why the private sector can't also self-regulate itself. Can't self-regulate, I should say. The elements of this voluntary preparedness program are wholly consistent with recent preparedness guidance issued by organizations such as the American National Standards Institute and the National Fire Protection Association. These standards DHS is going to develop but work closely with the private sector. It's going to help industry prepare for disasters and emergencies, including potential acts of bioterrorism. Like I mentioned earlier, the 9/11 Act, which was signed by the President this past August, also contained a number of provisions that are important when you think about mitigating the threat from bioterrorism. Here are a couple of examples within the law that outline how the government plans on improving private sector preparedness and mitigating the threat of a bioterrorism attack. Title IX of H.R. 1 requires DHS, again, to establish a program to enhance private sector preparedness, as I stated earlier. In addition, Title 11 there establishes a National Biosurveillance Integration Center, which will require the Secretary to ensure that chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear detection equipment and technologies are integrated, and that the federal government puts together a comprehensive plan and, like I said earlier, an international framework for trying to figure out if a bioterrorism event is occurring overseas, and what impact, if any, it's going to have here in the United States. I think the hope of this National Biosurveillance Integration Center is to create that common operating picture and to provide the early warning in the event of a bioterrorist attack. It's great to spend a lot of money on toys and technology and BioWatch, and it's important that we develop these technologies. But like I said earlier, if we don't have a window into what's going on overseas and globally, we are at a significant disadvantage in terms of bioterrorism. So far, Congress has moved to address these 9 issues by drafting any number of pieces of legislation, some of them dealing with bioterrorism, some of them not. And the committee is sort of committed to oversight of the department and ensuring that the department is focused on preventing a bioterrorism attack and is focused on creating a functioning Department of Homeland Security. The department isn't going anywhere. There's been lots of talk down in Washington amongst presidential candidates that we should maybe dismantle the Department of Homeland Security. It's probably not going to happen. So what we need to do is improve how it functions. The better the Department of Homeland Security functions, the safer we will all be in terms of bioterrorism. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thanks, Brandon. Batting cleanup, we have Dr. Greg Austin.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. My role here is not to make a presentation like these two gentlemen, but perhaps just a quick observation about East West Institute's work. I think the scenario, the situation that Mark and Brandon have outlined demonstrates the need for greater international cooperation in the area of preparing for biological attack, whether it's of a terrorist kind or more related to disease. In our discussions with representatives of governments from many countries, we've identified that this gap that Brandon has identified at the national level certainly exists at the international level. In our talks with the Chinese government officials, including the PLA, we've been told that the Chinese government regards biological attack as the most serious form of WMD attack by terrorists, and they're working very actively on public health aspects of that, but mostly from the point of view of resilience. So in a sense, I guess they've already absorbed the main point of Mark's presentation, that you really can't do much about some of these things in terms of actually detecting and preventing the attack, but you have to make sure that you're very well prepared in terms of resilience. The East West Institute would like to set up an international working group on biological weapons of mass terror, I guess is a better way of putting it than WMD because of Mark's very apt observations. And if anyone in the room is interested to take that further, please talk to us later. But Stuart, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. No, that was a very, very good couple of presentations, I thought, really hitting into the main issues. And there's a certain helplessness to some aspects of this, as you pointed out, and the government needs to do what it can to deal with the known knowns and even the known unknowns. But there are some unknown unknowns out there in the realm of the new technologies, and this is really it's the Wild West of some of the great threats that we're going to face in this country for the next couple of generations. So I think the two speakers gave a really excellent presentation of some of the threats out there, some of the facts on the ground. It's also important for the government to remain very flexible and innovative. Government, and one of the critiques of the Homeland Security Department is so big and unwieldy now that it might not have the ability to remain flexible and nimble in as much as our enemies might be, as creative as they might be, and that's one of the challenges we have to address. I have a couple of thoughts that could spark some discussion, but let's see if people have some questions for any of the individual speakers you might want to address, or for the panel. Now would be the time to have some direct questions. If you, yes, sir.
I'm from the United Nations, from the 1540 committee dealing with weapons of mass destruction and counter-terrorism. And there are two of my colleagues also from the United Nations here. Now, the main thrust of our work is with the regulation aspect of this, rules and regulations, and then with the enforcement. But the presentation today goes to the threat at the national level, although comments were made also about the threat from abroad. I have a number of points I have marked, so I just throw them without any system. One is, since the theme is industry, really the role of industry, my question is about the role of scientists, some kind of code of conduct, so that there will not be rogue scientists operating abroad, especially in the area of weapons of mass destruction. And I like the distinction between WMD and WMT. I think this is a very good concept to look at the broader threat and the narrow threat. My second point is in terms of biosignature. From the technological point of view, is there are some methods for home use being developed, for example, for testing, like the way you have a thermometer at home for measuring the temperature. It's the technical aspect of it. My next point is on the integration aspect of it. In some countries, the biofield is extremely complex, and some of the legislations are very old indeed. And how is it possible in the United States, for example, to have a simplified system where you could detect and announce? You know, the federal system makes it even more complex. And my last point is about an outbreak of a contagious disease as against an anthrax, you know, which is very, very serious, but not contagious. Is there any hint you could give about the way the technology is developed for the different types? I posed too many questions, I stopped there.
There's a couple that are clearly mine and a couple that are clearly yours. So, you know, a code of conduct among scientists is, I think, a direction that they appear to be heading now. At the last several meetings I've been to, you know, you want to have the free exchange of information, but people do see that perhaps the Australian scientists that showed you how to make smallpox went a little bit too far in releasing that so broadly. But for the scientists, you know, it works great for the scientists who sign up for the code of conduct. But another fact I heard from another conference was that half of the scientists that were working at Biopreparat, which was the Soviet Union's biowarfare, are unaccounted for. We don't know where half of them are. And we wouldn't even know how to bring them the letter to make them sign for a code of conduct. And so I think that that horse is already out of the barn, where those people are probably where they're going to, you know, where they want to be to continue their work, if it's continuing. Again, and you're going to know a lot more about this, but I just think it would be very risky for a state to really mount a big bioterror attack with some of these contagious pathogens. And again, with an outbreak of contagion, skipping to your last question, the way to you've got to be able to find who's infected and the mode of transmission, because if it's airborne, you know, if you send patient 0 on a plane and get him coughing a lot and getting everybody infected on a plane, you've got to be able to find out who's been infected, and that gets us to those tests. And it ought to be as simple as a home pregnancy test. It's the same kind of it's the same kind of biomarkers that you're looking for. We need to get it down to where you just take 1 drop of blood, put it on a strip, and if the X is blue, you're infected. And we can do that for a lot of pathogens right now. But those kits need to be in every hospital around the country, because again, we tend to focus on major cities like New York and LA as the centers for where terror attacks are going to be. But you can go to a small town in Iowa and really generate a lot of terror when 5-year-olds start dying from grapes. So I think that we really need to push development with the government to get tests available in all the centers that would be able to rule out, first, are you infected or not, and then what the infectious agent is. The science is there to do it, but it's just not been a priority.
Well, I would just piggyback on what Dr. Chandler said. I think a code of conduct for scientists sounds like a good idea. Unfortunately, everything you see about, everything you know about, say, Al-Qaeda and what the intelligence is telling us is that you're not going to get a person who's interested in conducting a bioterrorism attack to ever sign a code of conduct, and in all likelihood, you know, they may have not even been in the scientific community for long enough to even know that they are a scientist or involved in the biological field. To go to your other question on integration, right now we've got sort of a patchwork of different sort of biological detection systems out there. All these biological detection systems, they feed into, let's say, the local New York City Department of Health here, but the connections between the localities and the federal government is tenuous. There is no strong connection between, let's say, the Department of Homeland Security and the New York City Department of Health. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that the person who's responsible for reporting those results didn't know who exactly to call at DHS if it did go positive. We're just not developed enough yet to create that seamless, integrated system where you go from, hey, we've got a hit on a BioWatch sensor to informing the highest levels of government that perhaps we need to move into the response and recovery mode. So it's going to take some time, but in the meantime, the private sector is moving out on all these issues. It's continually developing new technology. And what the federal government needs to be doing is partnering with the private sector, keeping an eye on what's working and what isn't working, and sort of, you know, making sure that what does work gets funded and gets rolled out. But it can only be rolled out if there's an integrated system in place of states and localities, municipalities like New York City know who to talk to in the federal government and know how to raise that red flag in the event of an emergency. On 9/11, everyone knew there was an emergency. It was all over the television. But a bioterrorism attack is quite a bit different. It's going to be the silent killer to a certain extent, at least initially. So we need to sort of develop that system, and we don't have a robust system in place yet.
I'm going to throw a little optimism in this because some things that both of the speakers said at the beginning or during their talks is something we need to keep in mind, that there's a dual use for solving this problem. And the same solutions to solving the bioterrorism problem, which maybe Ted Kennedy's not interested in, are some of the same solutions that will make more robust our entire infrastructure of public health, which Ted Kennedy is interested in. And you do have a bipartisanship around this issue because it's solving, you know, the terrorist hawks will get something out of it, and the sort of the social welfare, you know, liberals will get something out of it in the public health arena. So I think there is an opportunity for that, but I want to add one layer to what you mentioned. You said the Department of Health for New York City talking to the federal agencies, but it's, as both of you pointed out, it's down more at the local and individual private sector level, the local doctors that are getting, you know, the calls in the middle of the night. You know, who are they networked in with? How is that information getting organized to determine, you know, where these hits are? Where are the concentric circles of a potential outbreak? Where are they beginning? And if it's already at the level of the office of the Department of Health in New York City, you're in a lot of trouble because you're already hours, if not days, if not even longer, and then you have a spread particularly if it's contagious, you know. So I think that's. Just real quick, I got into this in 1999 when I worked in the Senate, and there was an outbreak of the West Nile virus here in New York, and there were some rumors in the intelligence community at the time that Libyan officials infected some birds that were going to then maybe infect some people. So we were looking into it at the time, and when I was in the Senate, we called for a GAO report and an audit of how well did New York City handle this West Nile outbreak, and the answer was not very well. You know, the answer was that no one knew who to call, what to do, what it was, you know. And I don't know, I mean, the experts that are working on it right now you basically saying, Brandon, that we're not much further along than that yet.
I'm not saying, I mean, there's no system whatsoever, but all the exercises that have been conducted, particularly the top-offs, all the lessons learned from those exercises have shown us that there is a real problem in people being able to communicate with the right people within the federal government who can make the decision in terms of, do we need to move the national stockpile to New York City in the case of, you know, people needing antibiotics. But I also wanted to say that I completely agree that if we invest in biosurveillance and, you know, technology that can pick up on potential the spread of biological agents, we can do great things for public health. if we had a system that could track influenza. I mean, every winter we have outbreaks of influenza. If we could have those type of systems work for other biological agents, I think it puts us in a much better position.
Yes.
Do you have any relationship with the press in terms of what they do and don't report, in terms of, let's say, are there cases of children dying from eating grapes with something that shouldn't be on there, and it's kept out of the press? It's a notion of creating panic unnecessarily so.
My suspicion is that if just a kid or two has documented, they wouldn't know what got him, and so they wouldn't be able to put their finger on that.
And a doctor in that case who was, or a coroner would keep that out of the press for law enforcement.
Yeah, you know, they probably just, what docs do is when something is causing a fever, and which is the way all these things present, and eventually it's an unnamed virus. It's always blamed on a virus that they're not sure what it is. And so absent a big event where a lot of people are going down, I think the press would probably default that same way. They would just trust that, and it probably would be right in a lot of cases until it's not. And but I don't think you know, I think about it a lot. I wouldn't give the presentation today to a very large audience because it's a roadmap of exactly how to do this stuff. It's so easy, and you know, I wouldn't want that written about at all. It just I think that would be irresponsible. It'd be like putting on the internet how to build a bomb, you know, which is all over the internet, but I wouldn't want to do that.
There are only very, very limited circumstances where I could possibly think the United States government would ever want to withhold information from the press. I mean, the only times that ever really happens, and last time I could possibly think of was when the U.S. launched its attack in Iraq, where the people in the press room knew that it was happening before the rest of the country did. But other than that, it works sort of against the government if it begins to hide information from the public. That's how rumors get started. And what you don't want is an uninformed public. What you want is people to know what to do and not panic, frankly. And for the federal government, it just doesn't make any sense to withhold that type of information from the press.
Let me play devil's advocate on that for a second, because you brought up critical infrastructures, which is obviously an important issue for not just bio, but cyber is the place that most people are looking for critical infrastructures, because cyber terrorism can knock out, you know, electric grids and transportation centers and nuclear power plants. They could open firewalls of dams and a whole variety of other things. But as you pointed out, Brandon, a way around a back-ended version of a critical infrastructure attack could be through a bioterrorist attack, especially if it's a contagious disease. And it's not just that people who are sick won't go to work, it's that no one's going to go to work. Everyone's going to be avoiding the offices wherever they are, whether they're train stations, nuclear power plants, Goldman Sachs, financial sector, you know, you're talking about a major economic calamity and food shortages and everything that comes along with it. So balancing that outcome with a potential outbreak of a catastrophic, you know, virus or some kind of a pathogen, I don't know if the public really has a right to know. If it's an isolated, if it can be isolated, if it's in a community, I don't know I don't know if I agree with that, and I don't know if the government would actually behave that way.
Well,
balancing the costs.
if you look at the situation today in terms of what we're able to detect, in all likelihood, it's going to go way beyond a small community. For example, if there's, you know, a BioWatch hit at Grand Central, it's more than likely that there are going to be people who've been potentially exposed as far away as New Jersey, Westchester. It's going to be extremely, extremely difficult to keep that under wraps. And this is just my personal opinion, but I think it's best to try and get as much information as possible to people about what the real dangers are. I understand that some people are going to stay home, and some people are going to do what they want. But frankly, if people understand that, for example, that, you know, anthrax isn't necessarily communicable, and that, you know, they may alter their behavior, but they may not go to such extreme to sort of barricading themselves in their homes. So I think that the more information that we get out to the American public in cases of bioterrorism, the better, because frankly, we're not going to be able to contain, at least at the present state we are in, a bioterrorism attack from spreading to potentially thousands of people, especially here in a city like New York.
Yes, sir. And then over to the right.
I wonder if you have an idea of how much it would cost and how long it would take to put into place a biosignature program that would be adequate?
I'm not sure what it would cost to make all the little strips and how many clinics would have them, but the individual test itself should be about $1.
I meant a nationwide program.
Yeah, I don't know.
More than the 50 million.
More than the 55 million I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier. It would just be like pulling numbers out of the sky. I mean, everything costs more than it's initially projected to cost. So, if I told you 5 million, it'd be 10 billion. So, I don't know if that's really been studied to roll out a national biosignature. I'd have to look into it, but I couldn't possibly put a number on it.
But the individual test can be very inexpensive.
No follow-up to that, but yeah.
The FBI has a public-private initiative called InfraGuard, which is a information sharing forum between the Bureau and the private sector. Are you aware of any other government agencies, federal agencies, that have similar information sharing in the private sector?
Well, the Department of Homeland Security has a private sector office. In addition, the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis has outreach to the private sector. Again, the private sector also has access to all those systems I mentioned earlier, like HISN and LEO, these sites that offer unclassified information to the private sector security directors on potential threats. Besides InfraGuard, another excellent model is actually going on right here in New York City with the NYPD. The NYPD has a program in an office called NYPD Shield, which is by far the gold standard when it comes to working with the private sector. They hold regular trainings for private sector security directors on what to do in the event of a terrorist attack, what to do in the event of a bioterrorist attack. And they're on the phone every day with major Fortune 500 companies here in New York City. And if I had to say that, the NYPD Shield program is the gold standard. I don't know much about the FBI program. I know it's definitely out there, and the FBI should absolutely be working with the private sector, as should DHS.
Should they be sharing their information with DHS, and are they?
That's a complicated question. The FBI and the DHS and the Department of Homeland Security go back and forth, and one agency doesn't always know what the other agency is doing, frankly. But they are mandated by law to be sharing information. And very often they do, particularly in cases where there is, actionable intelligence that something is about to occur. Yes?
Hi, I'm a little bit interested about the concept of water. I know that right now there's been more of an interest in the privatization of the water supply. And so that means that it's beyond government control, beyond the realm of Homeland Security. So that would be an area that the private sector may, you might, of course, obviously be interested in speaking with people like Community Water who have control of the water supply. And then I'm a little bit concerned right now with this great interest in having everybody use tap water. And it just seems to me that tap water is, potentially dangerous. I mean, you can release toxins, yes it is, you can release bacterial agents in the water supply, and then you can knock out a great significant portion of the population if you popularize the idea of not having bottled water.
And you do not represent the Bottled Water Manufacturers Association.
I represent a very poor constituency of people that are just interested in going to these lectures, and I just try to have a very commonsensical approach to life in general. And it just seems that it's, it's something from San Francisco, and, it's like everybody's interested in preserving the environment. And actually, that is something that is on, I have like one of these books
on, creating a survival kit. And then what you need to do is you need to stock up on bottled water. How can you stock up on bottled water if bottled water doesn't exist because the government has outlawed it? How are these people in San Francisco going to survive a biological attack? I'm sorry, I'm going on. What have you been doing to research how biological agents can be infiltrated
Yeah.
through the water system?
Yeah, no, the question is how vulnerable is the water supply, right?
Vulnerable, but I'd like to know about different toxins, bacterial agents, and what studies I can look at on my own, because it's just a broad topic that's never much.
You know, it's unfortunate that a lot of the bottled waters are about, I think 60% of them come from regular municipal supply. And so you wouldn't necessarily be...
Test it at home with little kits to see whether or not...
That kit doesn't exist.
Why not?
Well,
that would be a hydro signature, and that's a new word I just made up.
Because it's, water is very robust. I mean, folks have tried to. One of the groups, I guess it was the SLS back in the 1970s, tried to infiltrate a water supply leading into some military installations, and they dumped, thousands of gallons of toxin into the water supply, and it didn't make it past a couple of feet because water is the universal solvent, and it's very difficult to actually create a mass-based attack like that. Now, if you get into the realm of where these guys work, which is sort of the next generation of witchcraft relating to biotechnologies and different, or I could envision the possibility of some type of a substance that could in some way reproduce in water instead of getting dissolved and dissipated in water. I don't think it exists yet, but I wouldn't put it past some people for trying to figure out what that is.
Yeah, I think there's so many easier ways to go
It's
after
a
it.
difficult way to do it.
The water supply, people have attempted to poison water supplies a lot. It's hard. It's diluted. It's it runs through. When it's prepared, it's fluoridated. It's chlorinated.
But what about through a corporation? You just mentioned the water fountain.
Oh yeah, I think that'd be a great way to do it.
So you just poisoned water.
But that's isolated.
Well, yeah, but that you poisoned a water fountain, and you haven't poisoned a water supply.
Could you poison a water supply for business? Like, let's say Goldman Sachs.
If they have water fountains, you could do it.
Water fountains.
Sure.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Could I, my name is Siddharth, I work along with my colleagues in the 1540 committee. This relates to a comment that you made with regard to scientists and the code of conduct. There are many professions around the world, including here, and bridge builders, who are licensed to practice their profession. Medical doctors. Would you, obviously this is a wide spectrum, but I mean, assuming that you're trying to fill up any hole that exists and you're trying to buttress your defenses against the entire spectrum, what is wrong with asking the private, we talked about the private sector, to say that if you employ somebody in any of one, say, a list of activities related to this, biological activities in the lab, then he must be licensed. And that license will have to be renewed. I mean, you need it for cars. You can't drive cars unless you're licensed to drive a car. And that means you've got to be tested. And here you do an additional test. You put in a mental test. Is the guy susceptible to, for example, suggestions? Is he susceptible to bribery, corruption, and so on and so forth? And you can develop. Now, is this absolute? Of course it is. The question here is that since in any case you have these kinds of certifications now in existence for things like bridges and buildings and etc. of Goldman Sachs. I mean, nobody can work in Goldman Sachs unless he is a CPA or whatever, and he can't be a CPA unless he's passed an exam, and he's regularly certified. You could do something, seems to me, similar for those who work in certain types of biological laboratories in the private sector, and say you cannot employ these people unless they are certified to be employable.
Mark, you work there, so you're
yeah, I think that, if you're in a biosafety level 4 facility, which is where Ebola hangs out, that you are given psychological tests, and before you're, there's not that many. I think it's maybe 5 BS4 facilities in the U.S., but they really do restrict for the reason that you're talking about. They want to make sure they've got some good psychological balance there.
We're talking about levels which are much lower than that. We're talking about
No,
2 and 3, for example. There's nothing wrong with asking for that test to be done. It's not going to cost a hell of a lot of money.
No, I don't think it would. I think that the people that adhere to it may be people that adhere to the law in general, and if you've always got your rogue scientist, which is what we fear.
Do you have a rogue employer? That's the point. I mean,
Yeah. No, if there's
have a rogue scientist. The question is,
Yeah.
the number of rogue employers are presumably somewhat less than the number of rogue scientists.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd hope. But I don't think people would resist that.
That's yeah, right. Okay.
Rob?
My question is going to take us off on a little bit of a tangent, but I'm just wondering a little bit about the context of all of this. There are a number of different threats where public-private cooperation is very important to come up with an effective solution. And I'm thinking in particular about port security, the security of nuclear plants, the security of chemical plants, and transportation security. So if anyone has enough background to put all of this in context in terms of how much money the federal government is spending right now on those kinds of projects compared to bioterrorism, what sorts of projects are already underway to address security in those other areas, and how interested is the private sector in cooperating with the federal government on security in those various areas?
I'll take a stab.
Yeah.
The federal government, I would say, is a little more focused on critical infrastructure, transportation, and port security right now than it is on bioterrorism. Particularly if you look at what's been passed and signed by the president, talk about the 9/11 bill. One of the bigger provisions in there was about a 100% screening of cargo. That the United States is going to require that every piece of cargo, a cargo container coming into the United States, was going to be screened. That's a significant commitment of manpower and money. There is no such commitment in terms of bioterrorism. There is no commitment to track biological agents per se on a global scale yet. At least the United States hasn't made that commitment to be able to track biological agents on a global scale. In terms of transportation, a lot of money, a lot of effort is going into securing New York City subways, because in all likelihood, that is the more likely attack. I think when you think about what we're spending time and money on, it all needs to be based on what the threat is. And while a bioterrorism attack is probably a high consequence in that a lot of people could be infected, its probability right now is probably low in terms of in the long term. The more likely attack is going to be your subway bombing. And the federal government is committed to working on shoring up those transportation nodes, the critical infrastructure that we think could more likely be the target of a terrorist attack. And so a lot of money is being spent in ports, a lot of money is being spent on cameras that watch bridges here in New York City. A lot of money is being spent simply on making sure that there's a police officer in almost every subway you ride on here in New York City. It's because it's being threat driven. Not to say that the threat from bioterrorism is nil, because it isn't. Because obviously it's happened before here in the United States back in 2001 with the anthrax attacks. But I think that it's not, let's say, in my top 3 of what the potential attack, if it's going to happen, would be. And I think that the federal government generally is taking a sort of similar view on that. And that's maybe why you haven't seen the extremely large commitments. I mean, $55 million, like I mentioned earlier, is not a very large commitment. So I think that's the reason. But if we were going to make a large commitment, I think building a national an international, global biosurveillance program would be where, I would invest, money.
And then there's a tension between the private sector because the government wants the private sector to pay for some of their own security because these sectors, like the chemical industry or the transportation industry, have the greatest interest in not seeing their sector destroyed. So there's this tension that's been going on with the government for a lot of years now. It's not clear where it actually, is going to fan out. But there's this kind of balance between get the private sector to pay for this stuff. It's their own security, it's their own industry, versus the private sector's not going to do it because it's going to cut into their profits. It's going to cost their competition with the next guy who's not going to do it. They're in this, in sort of a collective action problem. And it's up to the government to then, step in and try to make that happen. So that's going on, I think, across all of whether it's port security or chemical plant security or cyber security. It's a huge problem because you're exactly right. It is really a private sector and government partnership that's going on right now. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I would. I think that if you look at what's going on in the chemical sector, the federal government is not mandating particular security measures. What the language in the appropriations bill that passed told DHS to do was promulgate a set of sort of best practices. And I think to a certain extent the chemical industry was very, very happy about this because the federal government was not going to tell them, hey, you've got to put up a 5-foot fence with barbed wire. But on the other hand, maybe they do need a 5-foot fence with the barbed wire on top. And ultimately, that determination needs to be made between the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, or any other agency, and the private sector. There needs to be a meeting of the minds here on what is sort of the best course of action, because the private sector is in the business of making money. And they're going to resist when it costs too much money. So it behooves the government, the federal government, to build those relationships and make the case. Hey, you need the 5-foot fence with the barbed wire, not the 3-foot fence without the barbed wire. Please.
Yeah, just follow up on the answer and the question. On the question, I'm not an expert, but I was reading some congressional testimony in respect of a proposal for nuclear detection devices at major transport hubs. And the legislation being considered in the Congress, you know more about this than me, Brandon, was to do with a multi-year scheme costing billions of dollars over many years. And the question being asked by some Congress people was, should we really invest in this year or pass this bill for this sort of program that's tens of billions of dollars if we're not confident that in 5 years' time the same emphasis is going to be placed on detection of nuclear materials at major transportation hubs? And I think that sort of questioning exposes really the dilemma that has been referred to by Brandon and Mark both on this question of detection. And it's interesting if you compare the reaction in countries like the United States and countries elsewhere on the nuclear issue. In fact, New York City is the only city in the United States as of, I think, 18 months ago that had a full nuclear survey, aerial survey for radiological material. And the virtue of doing a nuclear survey for radiological material is that you can detect where are the major repositories of that material in the city to detect change later on. And I think what it all suggests to me is just the sheer impossibility of detection and prevention, or if not impossibility, the low likelihood of prevention and detection, and therefore it places a huge emphasis on the need for resilience. But a little footnote to the question about anthrax. As of late last year, the FBI hadn't captured or identified the people who perpetrated that attack. It was declared to be by the director of the FBI or one of the deputy directors the highest priority of the United States and FBI, or sorry, highest priority of the FBI to catch those perpetrators. It's quite curious that there's almost no press coverage globally or in the United States of the fact that the perpetrators remain undetected and uncaptured.
An interesting footnote to that footnote is the reason that the government knew it wasn't Al-Qaeda was because Al-Qaeda was actually more advanced in their anthrax manufacturing capabilities than the very sophisticated anthrax that was used in the 2001 attacks. As weaponized and dangerous and as deadly as those attacks were, it was a surprise to American government officials when they went to the al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan late 2001 into 2002, how advanced al-Qaeda actually was. And the different types, I mean, it's sort of a signature question mark, you know, they had a different signature on their anthrax that the American experts from the government discovered that al-Qaeda had on their computer programs, as well as also found in certain safe houses and other manufacturing areas that they had. So it's not al-Qaeda, because they're a little bit more sophisticated than those attacks.
Yeah, you know, everybody goes to anthrax, and I
Yeah.
don't get, because it's, once, you know, the docs were not on the lookout for it when that attack came. And now they, you know, they've all been alerted to it, and they get it, you see it, and you cure it.
Right.
And so spending billions on anthrax by some terrorists to weaponize it, no matter what you do, seems silly. I'm not sure why they'd pick that one.
Yeah, I mean, what's the worst case scenario of an anthrax attack? I mean, it would be
Running out of Cipro.
Or even in terms of the limitation of how many people it would affect. It affects only people that are directly sort of inhale or come in contact with. It's not contagious.
Thousands of spores.
Yeah.
You've got to inhale a lot.
I was there. Got thrown out of my building. These are really excellent questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in your presentation, it kind of seemed like it was fairly easy to create a biological weapon, and I could just go home and go on the internet and, you know, get some ingredients and, you know, just whip one up for myself. But if that was the case, then I think we would see a lot more successful attacks in recent years. We saw anthrax in 2001, but that killed, you know, a handful of people, and Sharengo in Tokyo didn't kill very many people either. And so I'm just wondering if it's maybe the execution of the attack is actually difficult, and that's what's deterring terrorists from actually using these weapons.
It depends on what type of pathogen or toxin you're talking about, because it is extremely easy to make ricin. It's extremely difficult for most of us here to grow up a lot of anthrax. That kind of gets into the realm of being a microbiologist to know how to do that. But you know, I think that you know, Brandon and I were talking before about how odd it is that nobody has done that, because it is, you know, it's as easy as I laid it out. You know, we've all bought grapes at the grocery store and kind of picked on them while we pushed our cart through the store. And if you do that, you know, if you don't take them home and wash them thoroughly and all that, then if somebody has sprayed ricin, you are going to die. And you know, that's the same for all the fruit. It's very easy it's very easy to implement that. And why haven't they? I don't know, but it's not because it's hard.
Well, I'd like to just make one comment along those lines.
Please.
I might give some credit, but also give enough credit to our intelligence community, because you're absolutely right, it is easy. And I suspect that many occurrences that don't take place is because of our intelligence community essentially cutting it short before it happens. And this is not what we read about in the New York Times or the Sunday Post. So there's some credit, I think, in terms of the number of incidences to the intelligence community that identifies and perhaps shuts it down before it happens.
Well, or in some cases, too much credit, because I don't know, about a year ago or 2 years ago, when did they raid a London apartment? And so now they find out, you heard of a ricin manufacturing operation. There were 22 seeds, and that's not really enough to do much, and some papers that had, you know, ricin descriptions in there. But they were not mounting. They've all been acquitted. They've all been let go, I think. And yet it was a big, you know, it's a big news story that we interceded in this big operation. It wasn't a big operation, at least not yet.
Just a quick note on that. I do agree that to a certain extent the intelligence community does a good job of preventing potential terrorist attacks. But I also think that from what we know of Al-Qaeda, they're interested in the spectacular attack, the fire and brimstone. And you don't really get that with a bioterrorist attack. Like I said earlier, it's kind of the silent killer. So I think it's two-sided. One side, I think the intelligence community is doing a much better job of tracking down potential plots. And I think that, you know, the main threat, which is Al-Qaeda, just simply is not as interested in something that would be as low-key as perhaps, you know, a relatively small bioterrorist attack. I think they're interested in
So
bigger.
why won't they plan a big, you know, if they could sneak some smallpox into a couple of planes and have some, you know, some folks cough on some people, and then they get the credit for this major outbreak, and they show the scientists that developed this and did it. I mean, I think that would be as spectacular as anything I could imagine in the realm of terrorism.
If it was smallpox, absolutely, because there's only 2 countries in the world that got it, us and the Russians. So if anyone got a hold of smallpox, we'd be in a lot of trouble, yes. But other than smallpox, I mean, perhaps if you could weaponize H5N1, maybe, I don't know. But again, that's not easy. Someone can't, you know, gin this stuff up in their bathtub. And usually when they try and gin stuff up in their bathtub, their next door neighbor who smells something weird calls, if you see something, say something. So there is a system out there in place within the intelligence community. I think that, again, we're fortunate in that, if you can even say that, you know, Al-Qaeda may not be as interested in at least bioterrorism as it would in perhaps a, you know, a larger conventional explosive type attack.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, a question for Mark. I've heard a former senior officer of the CIA in a couple of presentations talk about the future threat from biotechnology, you know, in the hands of terrorists, and he's mentioned some connection with nanotechnology, and I think by implication genetic modification. The proposition being the fear that using nanotechnology processes, which I don't understand, to deliver some forms of antibiotics or toxins or genetic modification is sort of opening up this Pandora's box of sort of, you know, a bleak future for us. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think it would have to be state-sponsored, and so I think that a state doing that would risk just obliteration in a response if they really distributed a genetically modified virus that could be contagious throughout the country. And I really don't have much fear of smallpox because most of us have been vaccinated. Odds are that the vaccination is going to be mostly protective, but even if we get it, you know, even in the old days, only 30% of the people infected died. And now we have supportive therapies. Probably 95% of the people who would contract smallpox would live. But if you genetically engineered, let's say Ebola, with the capability to spread as easily as the influenza strains that we see, and we have no immunity to, then that would be a big problem. But that's hard. It's going to be state-sponsored, and anybody who does that would really have, that would be a big splash if you could do that, because especially, you know, you go pretty horribly in those situations. That would be news.
Yeah. A couple more quick ones. Yes, sir.
No, just following up on the Ebola thing, the Japanese group, Shrinkyo, they had experimented with Ebola, and they were exploring possibilities in Africa for obtaining that, and they were very well funded. Fortunately, they were caught in the subway incidents.
Mm-hmm.
So it did not be actually state-sponsored. It would be big organizations.
Yeah.
And organizations that we don't know of, because although there was emphasis on Al-Qaeda, that's very well known. It could be locally based, some extremist groups, could be anywhere, that can mobilize resources.
Mm-hmm.
And establish laboratories in
Australia.
Yeah.
Because in fact,
Anyway,
I did have a laboratory in Australia.
Yeah.
I think that's right. You know, any sophisticated group could probably do that. Yeah, well-funded, sophisticated.
Yeah, I think sub-state can do this.
Yeah.
I think clearly they can do it. There's one, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in 99 or 98, they spent about $150,000 and just on just regular off-the-market material. There would be no surveillance by the government regulating any of the purchases, and a lot of these materials, genetic materials and other things, are still available, you know, with no government intervention. They built, they replicated the 1919 flu virus with just about $150,000 and off-the-shelf, you know, products. So I think I don't think it's just state. I understand state is where you want it to be because it's the best place we can regulate and control and threaten and deter. But I think there is a sub-state actor problem here, and we're going to see some of it coming around. I think we have, yes?
Just on the comment on Shriko, if there are well-known groups, they're probably being watched in some way. And in Shriko, the government was watching them for 10 years and knew quite a bit of all the procurement of many types of technologies. So because of the internal politics and the nature of the group, et cetera, they were just doing that balancing act. So it wasn't out of the blue.
Just another thing to think about is that while you can get the scientists together, you can have the knowledge, and you can have the laboratory and all the technology, you still run into a problem of delivery. And that's always going to be an issue with doing a bioterrorism attack that's going to have effect on a large scale. You've got to figure out a delivery system that's going to be effective. And fortunately for us, it's pretty difficult to deliver many of these biological agents over a widespread area and have the impact that you want to have, meaning, you know, 90% of the people infected and, you know, 50% of those people dying. So you can have well-funded terrorist organizations, sub-state organizations with the technology and the laboratory, but they're always going to run into the technological difficulty of delivering over a large area.
Yeah, Shriko in particular tried using anthrax first, and they tried to dump a bunch of it off a building in Tokyo, and it just withered away, as Mark pointed out. The sunlight hit it, the wind hit it, and it went away. Then they chose sarin, which is much more easily to create and easily to deliver, but doesn't have as potentially, you know, high an impact. Anything else? Now's the time. Yes. Yeah, please.
I was thinking, I know this is slightly unrelated, but you know when the Northeast corridor completely went, there was a big blackout that affected a quarter of the United States. Yet, on the news, basically the Department of State said that it was not a terrorist attack. It seems that something coordinated with a biological attack would be effective, where they would be able to infiltrate that particular electrical system and then introduce some sort of biological agent. It just seems that these terrorists or these sub-governments are testing out equipment. And it seems that I think that you're talking about integrating things. Like, we need more communication. I know that we're not supposed to know everything that's going on with the government, but it just seems that, you know, people are doing these little tests, and then, you know what I mean, it's a matter of coordinating the information so we can figure out how we can counteract these potential disastrous scenarios. And I guess, you know, like when it comes to the public sector, you know, I guess I would like to be a little bit more informed about those types of things.
I actually thought that's what it was. I was here in August of, I think it was 05. That was my first, I was just fresh back from Washington. I was scared as hell, like he probably is right now with all the information we were getting down there. And my first thing, because the government does think that there would be a coordinated attack like that. When the electric system went out in New York City, I was living here, and my first reaction was there's going to be a follow-on attack from that. And there ended up not being one, and it just ended up being, you know, electrical grid problem.
Well,
But
for some reason, I guess they're not armed yet with the biological agent that would cause.
or they're not, or they don't, or it's too difficult, or they are waiting for a spectacular opportunity.
Yeah, they're not necessarily on our timetable. They don't really care about blackouts and you know, necessarily our elections. They're interested in striking when it suits their purposes. So I don't necessarily think there's always a correlation between events like the blackout and all of a sudden, terrorists think it's the opportune time to strike.
No, she means they did the blackout and.
Oh, well, I certainly
That's what I thought.
don't think that terrorists did the blackout, but.
No, but that they might do a blackout and then have another event to go along with it.
Sure, coordinated attacks is the hallmark of modern terrorism,
Right.
but again, I think that, that you don't necessarily need to cause a blackout to have a follow-on terrorist attack, so.
We'll save that one for the Hollywood movies then, okay.
Insofar as if the concept that terrorists do want to reach the 6 o'clock news, and bioterrorism is not necessarily the first choice. And if you're going to induce a blackout, you won't have a 6 o'clock news in which to make now, whether or not they're going to think like that.
So they create mass panic. For some reason, panic was not created in the area because of the radio.
Yeah, but the bio
You were connected through the radio.
days to.
I don't understand why that wouldn't create a serious problem with mass riots and things of that nature. And then if you coordinate it with the biological agents, then you are knocking out people who don't have the transportation needs to get to the hospital and get checked or have their little,
Don't give anyone any ideas. We don't want
their
them.
little kits.
Yeah, one and then two, please.
I was just to follow up, I mean, the scenarios that are approached here are take an incredible amount of organization, and I think, at least from the jihadi perspective, with their missions, their suicide bombings in Madrid and London and Scotland and even 9/11, while there is an amount of organization, often it's luck that the people that are caught, and with the intelligence that we have, the number of probable attacks that have been stopped, it's always from the incredibly disorganized groups that come about to create these. It's not like an overarching organization with the top-down authority. There are little pockets of people and friends that get together and try to determine what, is something big. The airports was, 4 or 5 doctors that got together and recently, and it was the lack of planning that made things go wrong. So I think that's a positive note for us, where we can come up with these scenarios. As of yet, Enriqueo being incredibly organized and not of a totally very different perspective. It's unusual. It takes a very dedicated person. Yeah, it was mine.
No, it's a good question. They addressed it. They're basically, both gentlemen said that it takes a lot of sophistication. I mean, to the extent sometimes only states can do the real mass casualty attacks. But at a minimum, it takes a lot of organization and a lot of money, and you need good scientists. I mean, these were all the issues that were addressed. And hopefully those hurdles are high enough to prevent an attack from happening. I don't want to, let's have one last one.
A similar question, actually, really has to do with the nature of the MO of Al-Qaeda, and I think Mr. Declet, you summed it up rather nicely when you said that they go for this shock and awe sort of strategy. It would appear to me that just by the nature of the technology we're talking about, that it has a lot of applications for more clandestine forms of attacks. And I was wondering if there was any intelligence that you've been made aware of where there may be plans for pinpoint attacks, assassinations, these sorts of things.
Well,
I wouldn't ask you to give me specifics.
no, I mean, I think it's pretty well known that there is an overall threat. I mean, the president's Homeland Security strategy says that there are terrorist organizations interested in carrying out attacks with weapons of mass destruction. But I mean, without getting into a classified realm, there's no specific, this is the time, place, and this is going to be the event. And in intelligence, it's actually very, very, very rare that you ever get that. And most of what intelligence is piecing together a jigsaw puzzle and hoping in the end that you catch the guy before he decides to do something terrible.
In 2003, intelligence did intercept Ayman al-Zawahiri ordering a chemical attack on the New York City subway system. And they also found him with calling off the attack because he said to his operatives that there was something bigger planned. So that got everyone a little nervous. And they thought that something bigger was a bio rather than a chemical attack.
Well, in
But it
terms
ended up
of
not happening yet.
The methodology of these groups, has there been anything that would indicate that they might want to pursue a more small-scale attacks on pinpoint targets, or is this completely outside the realm of their activity?
If you're talking about the A team of Al Qaeda, they're consistently interested in spectacular, large-scale attacks. If you're talking, let's say, Al Qaeda in Iraq, they're more interested in those pinpoint types of attacks against American forces and their allies. So I don't think you can make a sort of broad generalization that that they're more focused on pinpoint rather than sort of the larger.
Yeah,
larger
if they're gonna try to knock off Benazir Bhutto, they might as well use a gun. They don't need to go and poison her with ricin.
Or polonium.
Yeah. I think that was an excellent talk and great Q&A. So let's at least give our panelists some